to reports, Ukraine's counter-offensive has begun. And will the massive dam collapse in the country help Ukraine change the course of the war? India-Canada relations have reached a new low after a float that celebrated the assassination of former Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And will Donald Trump's presidency plans be impacted by an unprecedented second indictment? A very warm welcome to World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. We'll deep dive into our top stories. First up are the headlines. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson resigns as MP with immediate effect over Partygate report. House of Commons committee found Johnson had misled the parliament and recommended lengthy suspension. In a show of support, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pays a surprise visit to Kyiv as Ukraine braces for a major counter-offensive. NATO member Canada has supplied much military and financial assistance to Ukraine. US doubles down on claims that Iran is sending drones to Russia. Based on US intel findings, Washington accuses the Iranian government of helping Russia to build a drone manufacturing plant near Moscow, marking an escalation of their defense cooperation. And 4 children found alive after surviving a plane crash on 1st May in Colombia's Amazon jungle. They spent 4 weeks fending for themselves after the aircraft crashed, killing their mother and 2 pilots. It's 15 months and counting for the Russia-Ukraine war. This week, the collapse of the Nova Kakhovka dam in Ukraine, it's one of the biggest ecological disasters in Europe in the last few decades. It's still impossible to say whether the dam collapsed because it was deliberately targeted or if the breach could have been caused by structure failure. The dam and hydroelectric power plant are under Russian control and therefore inaccessible to independent investigators. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is describing the situation as an environmental bomb of mass destruction. Meanwhile, the chorus for Ukraine's inclusion in NATO continues. Ukraine's former defense minister has said that the alliance should admit Ukraine not sooner or later, but now, because the country is the world's best enforcer and a state that can do much to ensure Europe's safety. In the meantime, UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and US President Joe Biden held wide-ranging talks at the White House too. The leaders reiterated their unwavering support for Ukraine. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as well. Let's try and get in a sense of perspective in terms of where this war is headed and how is Ukraine's counter-offensive shaping up. And for that, I'm joined in by Jamil N. Jaffer, who is the Executive Director of the National Security Institute at the Quincy Institute. Many thanks to you, Jamil, for joining in. What will Ukraine's dam disaster now mean for the war? And is it expected to impact Ukraine's counter-offensive?
Well, obviously, the breaching of the dam on the Dnieper River obviously is a huge issue. We're talking about almost 18 million gallons, or liters, cubic meters of water that are behind this dam that have now been flowing out across. It's flooding significant areas, hampering drinking water for people downstream. But also, it's worth noting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant there in Europe, it's been shut down for a while. But it draws its cooling water from the dammed area, from that reservoir. And so it's starting to get less water. Now, their pumps are able to work and are functioning fine. And these 5 reactors are in a shutdown mode, 5 to 6 reactors. But the challenge is that in the long run, if they can't continue to draw water, that could create a potential situation where you need to bring water in from the outside to cool those cores that are still obviously hot and will remain hot for many years.
Right.
And so those are some of the challenges that this dam breach is causing. It's the drinking water issue. And the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that are the key issues when it comes to the dam.
Right, Jamil, even though Ukraine has still not officially announced their counter-offensive, what are the major tactical challenges for Ukraine's offensive?
Well, Ukraine hasn't officially announced the beginning of the counteroffensive, but we know that they've begun to press Russian forces in a variety of places. We've heard about significant fighting in Donetsk, in Bakhmut, right, in Kherson. And so we know that there's active fighting going on, and it does appear the Ukrainians are pushing in a strong way. The question is whether they'll be successful and how successful they'll be. Obviously, they're continuing to receive a significant amount of supplies from NATO and the West. those Abrams tanks and the Challenger tanks that have been promised. They're still being trained on. Those aren't in the fight quite yet. And the F-16s are still months away from getting in the fight because it's going to take months to train up the Ukrainians and then bring them into the fight. So some of those key capabilities aren't there. At the same time, they do have those HIMARS missiles, the Patriot defensive capabilities and the like, and all of that is really coming into play. And so the question will be, how much of a push can they make? How far can they push the Russians back off of their current lines? It's unlikely this counteroffensive will push the Russians completely out of Ukraine, but it may make a significant dent. And if they do, the question is, what will the Russian response be? And how are the Russians able to coordinate their activities between Russian regular forces and the Wagner forces run by Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Right. Many thanks to you, Jamil, for bringing in your precious perspective to this news story. And with that, let's now shift focus over to the United States. Former United States President Donald Trump has been indicted in connection with the classified documents case. Remember, this is the second time Trump has been indicted. Trump faces 31 counts related to his handling of national defense documents after he left office, and it marks the first time a former president has faced federal charges. Donald Trump has been ordered to appear at the Miami Federal Court on Tuesday, and there's speculation that he will be arrested once again. Interestingly, the indictment details the locations where Donald Trump allegedly stored classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. They were reportedly stored in a ballroom, a bathroom and shower, an office space, even his bedroom and a storage room. This is the second case in which Trump is facing criminal charges. Trump was indicted by a Manhattan grand jury back in March, where he faces criminal charges in New York over hush money payments made to adult entertainer Stormy Daniels. It spells more trouble for the former president, who's running once again for the post in 2024.
It's just a continuation, 7 years, even after I'm out. But it's called election interference. They're trying to destroy a reputation so they can win an election. That's just as bad as doing any of the other things that have been done over the last number of years, and especially during the 2020 election. So I just want to tell you, I'm an innocent man. I did nothing wrong. And we will fight this out just like we've been fighting for 7 years. It would be wonderful if we could devote our full time to making America great again. And that's exactly what we did. But now, again, our country is in decline. Very unfair, but that's the way it is. I'm innocent, and we will prove that very, very soundly and hopefully very quickly.
Mr. President, what do you say to Americans to convince them that they should trust the independence and fairness of the Justice Department when your predecessor, Donald Trump, repeatedly attacks it?
Because you notice, I have never once, not one single time, suggested to the Justice Department what they should do or not do, or else to bring a charge or not bring a charge. I'm honest.
And staying with the story, here's a CNN report for more on what this indictment means for Donald Trump and what happens next.
The 49-page indictment unsealed Friday gives a look into former President Trump's alleged mishandling of classified documents. Next official move, a court appearance in Miami, scheduled for Tuesday.
We very much look forward to presenting our case to a jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida.
Yet little about this is traditional. Trump is shaking up his legal team so much his lawyer speaking for him Thursday stepped aside Friday.
It'll make some excitement to see who shows up at the table on Tuesday.
I mean, she should be going to jail. I don't know what the hell's going on.
Meanwhile, Trump, who vilified Hillary Clinton in 2016 for her handling of classified information, plans to campaign himself this weekend in Georgia and North Carolina.
Hello, Fort Liberty.
The same state where President Biden appeared Friday, making no mention of the indictment of his predecessor and potential 2024 rival. A Republican candidate says Trump should end his campaign.
That's a serious violation of the responsibility to keep classified material protected.
Other Republicans' reactions range from pragmatism to rallying the party.
It goes to the core of equal justice for all, which is not being seen today, and we are not going to stand for it.
The case and campaign season will coincide. One of Trump's former attorneys points out if he were to win the presidency,
If it's still pending, he dismisses the case.
Donald Trump could shake things up yet again.
And so what will this mean for Donald Trump's presidency? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. I am joined in by Democrat strategist Nicole Brenner-Schmitz, who's joining me live right now. Nicole, thank you for joining in. It's, of course, double trouble for Donald Trump. Could a second unprecedented indictment hurt Trump more than his past scandals have?
Well, look, it depends on what electorate you're looking at. The reality is we have seen time and time again that the Republican base will support him no matter what. I mean, let's remember when the first indictments, the first invasion, as he called it, of Mar-a-Lago, a gentleman went to an Ohio FBI office and started a crime. I mean, these people are taking extraordinary violent measures to defend him. And then a week later, he said, well, I did take the classified documents home, but it's no big deal. So there's a dangerous possibility of what certain people in the American electorate will do. But it absolutely does hurt him, even if he wins the Republican nomination. This is exactly what independents in the country said, no more. He's gone too far. He is not the Republican that we voted for. We thought we were voting for in 2016. We're voting for Joe Biden. It was less of a we love Joe Biden and more of a rejection of Donald Trump. And he's only gone further in these antics. He's only proved their concern with him over and over again through these indictments, along with Joe Biden showing that he can work in a bipartisan manner, as he said, and get things done that have been lingering in American politics, like a huge infrastructure bill, which is a giant jobs generator, for over a decade. So yes, it hurts him in a general, but we may still well see him be the nominee out of the Republican Party.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole Brenner-Schmitz, for joining in. And with that, let's now shift focus over to India and Canada. Ties between the two nations have reached a new low owing to two incidents. One is, of course, a shocking incident in Brampton in Canada. A video has come to light which shows a 5-kilometer-long parade with a tableau of India's former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's assassination in 1984. Now, it should be noted that this float was celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi. The parade with the tableau was reportedly held by separatist Sikh groups. The High Commissioner for Canada in India, Cameron Mackay, has condemned this incident. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has also stated that this is not the first time that such an incident of its kind has taken place and that the government needs to take action as it's not good for ties between the two nations. The second matter is that of over 700 Indian students who are at risk of deportation after receiving fraudulent admission letters to Canadian institutions. Canadian authorities had issued deportation notices to these students, but that process has been temporarily paused. Let's also listen in to the reactions that have come in, starting with India's External Affairs Minister.
This float issue used. Let me actually answer it, because I think there's a bigger issue involved. And the bigger issue involved is really the space that Canada has continuously and frankly to us, we are at a loss to understand, other than the requirements of vote bank politics, why anybody would do this. Because if you look at their history, I mean, you would imagine that they learn by the history and they wouldn't like to repeat that history.
Pakistan supporters in Canada have reached a new low with a despicable float in a recent Brampton parade. The float celebrated the assassination of Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi with her cutout in white sari soaked in blood and cutouts of her bodyguards turned killers brandishing and pointing guns. This is not what our country Canada stands for. Tolerating the glorification of violence and public promotion of hate goes against everything our country believes in. Khalistan supporters have crossed the line, and Canada should and must respond.
Certainly, this is a new nadir for the India-Canada relationship. But what will this mean, and is there any way forward? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. I'm joined in by senior Canadian journalist Terry Milesi, who joins me live. Thank you, Terry, for joining in. This, of course, if you talk about the float, celebrating the assassination of India's former Prime Minister, that too by Sikh extremists. While many in Canada may want to call it free speech instead of hate speech, what explains Canada's lackadaisical approach to Sikh radicals?
Canadian politicians have proved themselves to be absolute cowards. They are afraid to say anything because they think that they will lose votes of the extremists, which votes that they shouldn't be pursuing anyway, if they say anything about these obscene and grotesque displays of reverence for terrorist martyrs, so-called. And remember that this is only the latest example of this. It's been going on for 20 years. It's been worse. Not just the killers of Indira Gandhi, but the Air India bomber, Talvinder Singh Parmar, who slaughtered 331 completely innocent civilians who had nothing to do with the struggle for Khalistan back in 1985, and the bombing of Air India 182. And there are many other examples where they, for example, have named the headquarters of their campaign for a referendum on Sikh independence after the same Parmar. So they've named their campaign after a man who is, in fact, Canada's worst ever mass murderer. So they are afraid, the politicians are afraid that if they say anything about displays like the one you described in Brampton recently, that they will be attacked, that they will lose votes, because the Khalistanis are the most mobilized and the most vocal.
All right. Terry, also, does the Modi government now need a broader diplomatic strategy to ensure a more effective way to address friction points, that too of the issue of separatism and Khalistan, and also study permits for Indian students? I'd also like to ask you, what do you make of the Canadian High Commissioner's statement?
Yes, I think that the Indian government, look, it's not, you're not coming to me for advice for the Indian government. They know better than I do what they want to do. But let me offer a couple of thoughts anyway. The first is that Indian politicians have traditionally been content to bang the table and say, why doesn't Canada crack down on this kind of thing? Lock them up. And they don't get what they want. Well, guess what? They need to, if you'll forgive me, grow up and smell the coffee. They need to wake up. There are no Western democracies on offer which are going to suspend and abolish the right of free speech. We see free speech as sacred. This isn't India. We are governed by Canadian law, UK law, German law, Australian law on free speech. It isn't to be swept away when it's convenient diplomatically. So Indian politicians need to be a bit more sophisticated about this and get something worthwhile. And I'll tell you what that is. They hold the whip hand. India is a more important country every day. Canada needs India more than the reverse. So let's set a price. Why doesn't India say to Canada, okay, you want access to the Indian market. You want free trade with India. We're not going to deal with any Canadian politician who fails to explicitly and publicly condemn such reverence and glorification for violence and intimidation. I draw your attention to the statement on this Brampton case by the Canadian High Commissioner in New Delhi, a very good man, name is Cameron McKay, and he made an excellent statement condemning this display. But in my humble opinion, he made a mistake in that statement. If you look carefully at it, he says there is no place in Canada for this kind of hate and glorification of violence. Well, what he should have said, to be correct, is that there should be no place in Canada for that.
All right, Terry, I think you hit the nail on its head. But thank you so much for joining in. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break. Don't go anywhere, because global news and headlines continue on World 360.